Imagine two people working the same hours, with the same intelligence and the same resources. One constantly feels overwhelmed, busy, and exhausted. The other seems calm, focused, and effective, finishing important work while still having time for life. The difference between them is not talent, discipline, or luck. It is the way they make choices. In Smarter, Faster, Better, Charles Duhigg reveals that productivity is not about doing more things. It is about doing the right things in the right way by understanding how our brains make decisions. Through real stories, from a U.S. Marines to Google, from airline cockpits to poker tables, this book uncovers the hidden principles that separate the merely busy from the genuinely productive. Charles Duhigg's exploration of productivity begins with a personal frustration. While writing his previous book, he felt overwhelmed, constantly behind, and stretched thin between work and family. Curious about how some people manage to accomplish so much without burning out, he reached out to Atul Gawande, a surgeon, writer, and public health leader whose productivity seemed almost superhuman. When Gawande declined to talk because he was busy spending time with his family, Duhigg realized something important. True productivity is not about working nonstop. It is about making deliberate choices with time, energy, and attention. That realization led him on a multi-year investigation into how individuals and organizations achieve extraordinary results. Duhigg discovered that productivity is not driven by tools, apps, or longer hours. Instead, it is shaped by how we perceive control, work with others, maintain focus, set goals, make decisions, encourage innovation, and absorb information. These ideas form the backbone of the book. Chapter 1: Motivation, a Sense of Control. The story of Robert Philippe is a powerful and unsettling way to begin understanding motivation. Robert was not an average man who suddenly became lazy. He was a highly successful businessman who had built an empire through energy, charisma, and relentless drive. Yet after a brief illness during a trip to South America, that drive vanished. He did not become sad, angry, or confused. He simply stopped wanting to do anything at all. Doctors were puzzled because Robert's intelligence, memory, and reasoning were intact. He understood what needed to be done in his business and personal life, but he felt no urge to act. Eventually, neurologists discovered tiny injuries in a deep part of his brain called the striatum. This region acts as a bridge between decision-making and action. When it was damaged, Robert could still think, but he could no longer initiate behavior. This medical mystery reveals a crucial truth about productivity. Motivation is not about intelligence, discipline, or even desire. It is about feeling in control. When people believe their choices matter, their brains generate energy and momentum. When that sense of control disappears, motivation collapses. Experiments confirm this idea. In one study, participants played an intentionally boring guessing game. When they were allowed to make choices themselves, their brains lit up with excitement and anticipation. When a computer made choices for them, those same brain regions went quiet, even though the odds and rewards were identical. The simple act of choosing created motivation. This insight explains why the U.S. Marine Corps radically redesigned boot camp. Instead of turning recruits into passive rule followers, trainers force them to make decisions under pressure. Recruits are given ambiguous problems and minimal guidance. They are rewarded not for obedience, but for initiative. Over time, this builds what the Marines call a bias toward action. The deeper lesson is that motivation grows when we link choices to meaning. Recruits are taught to ask, why, when tasks become painful. Why climb this hill? Why keep moving? When effort is tied to values, identity, or loved ones, motivation becomes stronger and more durable. True motivation, Duhigg shows, is a habit of interpreting life as a series of meaningful choices. When we frame tasks as proof that we are in control and acting for something larger than ourselves, motivation stops being forced. And Chapter 2: Teams, Psychological Safety. While motivation explains individual productivity, teams introduce a different challenge. Why do some groups outperform others even when everyone seems equally talented? To answer this, researchers at Google studied hundreds of teams, analyzing everything from intelligence to leadership styles. What they found surprised them. The best teams are not defined by who was on the team, but by how team members treated one another. The single most important factor was psychological safety, a shared belief that it is safe to speak up, admit mistakes, ask questions, and challenge ideas. On teams with high psychological safety, conversations were balanced. No single voice dominated. People listened to one another, noticed emotional cues, and responded with empathy. Members felt respected, not judged. This allowed ideas to surface early before problems became disasters. Duhigg illustrates this principle through environments like Saturday Night Live. The show appears chaotic, but it works because writers and performers trust one another enough to take creative risks. Many sketches fail, but the culture encourages experimentation rather than punishment. When teams lack psychological safety, people hide mistakes, suppress ideas, and focus on self-protection rather than collaboration. Productivity suffers not because of incompetence, but because fear replaces trust. The key takeaway is that effective teamwork depends less on authority and more on emotional intelligence. Teams thrive when people feel heard, respected, and safe enough to be imperfect. Chapter 3. Focus, Mental Models. Focus is often misunderstood as sheer concentration. But Duhigg shows that focus is really about interpretation, how we make sense of complex situations. The tragic crash of Air France Flight 447 demonstrates this clearly. When key sensors failed, pilots were flooded with conflicting data. Instead of stepping back to understand the situation, they fixated on individual readings. They lost their mental model of what was happening and made fatal decisions. Mental models are simplified frameworks that help us understand reality. Experienced professionals rely on them to cut through noise and focus on what matters most. Pilots, doctors, firefighters, and leaders use mental models to anticipate problems and guide action under stress. Productive people deliberately practice these models. They rehearse scenarios, ask structured questions, and imagine how situations might unfold. This prevents cognitive tunneling, where attention narrows too much and critical information is ignored. Duhigg emphasizes that focus improves when we slow down our thinking, clarify priorities, and prepare for uncertainty. The goal is not to process more information, but to process the right information. Chapter 4. Goal Setting, Big and Small Goals. Goals shape behavior, but not all goals are productive. Duhigg distinguishes between stretch goals and SMART goals. Stretch goals are ambitious and inspiring. They push people to think creatively and aim higher than they thought possible. SMART goals, on the other hand, are specific and practical. They guide daily actions. Problems arise when organizations obsess over stretch goals and ignore details. This mistake is illustrated by Israel's failure to anticipate the Yom Kippur War. Leaders were so committed to their strategic assumptions that they dismissed warning signs that did not fit their expectations. Productive goal setting requires balance. Big goals provide direction, but small goals provide traction. The most effective individuals and organizations constantly adjust tactics based on feedback rather than clinging to rigid plans. Duhigg's insight is that goals should create flexibility, not blindness. When people combine ambition with humility, they stay alert, adaptive, and effective, even in unpredictable environments. Chapter 5. Managing Others, Trust, Autonomy, and Smart Systems. Productivity changes dramatically when we move from managing ourselves to managing others. Many leaders believe productivity comes from tighter control, clearer rules, and closer supervision. Charles Duhigg shows that the opposite is often true. The most productive organizations are built on trust, autonomy, and systems that help people adapt rather than obey. Duhigg illustrates this through a real kidnapping case handled by the FBI. Instead of relying on rigid hierarchies and traditional command and control methods, agents adopted principles from lean manufacturing and agile management. Information was shared openly across teams. Decisions were made quickly, based on real-time feedback, rather than waiting for approval from the top. This shift mattered because complex problems cannot be solved through strict instructions alone. In fast-moving situations, people closest to the problem often have the best information. When leaders trust their teams to act, productivity increases because decisions happen faster and morale improves. Duhigg contrasts this with organizations where employees feel monitored and constrained. In such environments, people focus on avoiding mistakes rather than solving problems. Initiative disappears, creativity fades, and productivity becomes mechanical. Effective management, the book argues, is about building systems that support judgment. Leaders should define clear goals, create transparent processes, and then step back. When people feel trusted, they take ownership. When they feel controlled, they disengage. Chapter 6: Decision-Making. Thinking in Probabilities. Every day, productivity is shaped by decisions. What to work on, what to ignore, when to act, and when to wait. Yet most people make decisions by clinging to certainty. Duhigg explains that the best decision-makers think in probabilities rather than predictions. This idea is brought to life through the world of professional poker. Elite players do not expect to be right every time. Instead, they constantly revise their assumptions based on new information. Each card changes the odds, and good players adjust accordingly. This probabilistic mindset contrasts sharply with rigid thinking, where people commit to a single narrative and ignore evidence that challenges it. Such thinking leads to overconfidence, poor judgment, and wasted effort. Duhigg introduces Bayesian reasoning as a practical framework. Rather than asking, "What will happen?" productive thinkers ask, "What are the possible outcomes and how likely are they?" When new data appears, they update their beliefs instead of defending old ones. Productivity improves when decisions are treated as experiments rather than verdicts. By remaining flexible and open to revision, individuals and organizations avoid costly mistakes and adapt more quickly to change. Chapter 7: Innovation, Creative Tension and Failure. Innovation is often romanticized as a moment of sudden inspiration. In reality, Duhigg shows that innovation usually emerges from struggle, disagreement, and repeated failure. The story of Disney's Frozen reveals this truth. Early versions of the film were deeply flawed. Characters felt flat, the story lacked emotional depth, and deadlines were approaching fast. Rather than enforcing consensus, leaders encouraged open criticism and debate. This environment created creative tension, a space where people felt safe challenging one another while remaining committed to a shared goal. Painful feedback forced the team to confront weaknesses and rethink assumptions. The result was a stronger story and one of the most successful animated films ever made. Duhigg emphasizes that innovative cultures do not avoid conflict. They structure it. Productive organizations build systems that allow disagreement without fear of punishment. Failure is treated as information, not incompetence. Innovation flourishes when people are encouraged to experiment, question authority, and iterate quickly. Productivity, in this sense, is not about efficiency alone, but about learning faster than competitors. Chapter 8: Absorbing Data, Turning Information into Action. Modern work environments are flooded with data. The challenge is no longer access to information, but knowing what to do with it. Duhigg argues that productivity depends on how information is framed and absorbed. This principle is illustrated through reforms in Cincinnati's public schools. Instead of overwhelming teachers with endless statistics, administrators focused on a small number of meaningful indicators. Data was presented as questions. What is working? Where are students struggling? Rather than commands. By slowing down the flow of information and encouraging reflection, educators were able to make better decisions. Teachers felt empowered rather than judged, and student outcomes improved. Duhigg's insight is that data becomes useful only when it invites action. When information is too dense or prescriptive, it paralyzes. When it is selective and contextual, it guides. Productive individuals and organizations learn to filter information, ask better questions, and pause long enough to understand what the data is really saying. In doing so, they transform information overload into clarity and momentum. Productivity is not about working harder, longer, or faster. It is about making smarter choices. When we feel in control, collaborate with trust, focus using mental models, set balanced goals, empower others, think probabilistically, embrace creative tension, and absorb information wisely, productivity becomes natural. Smarter, faster, better reminds us that the most productive lives are not the busiest ones. They're the ones shaped by intention, clarity, and purpose.